The wind moved across the plains like a ghost that never rested, carrying with it the dry whisper of tumbleweeds and old prayers. Henry Cole had stopped listening to the sound of it years ago. His cabin stood alone on a patch of hard earth, the boards worn silver by sun and sand. Every morning he'd wake before dawn, light the fire, and make coffee so strong it burned the tongue. He didn't talk much. There was no one left to talk to. The old horse in the stable barely moved these days, and the cattle had thinned with every bad season. But Henry didn't mind the silence. He'd lived with it too long to fear it. It was like an old friend, one that never asked for more than he could give. He'd buried his wife, Anna, 40 years back, under a cottonwood that still grew crooked and stubborn on the hill. Back then, he'd been a younger man, strong, hopeful, the kind who believed love could tame the West, but the world had other ideas. Fever took her before the crops came in, and by the time Henry stopped digging the frozen ground, something inside him had gone cold too. He'd tried to keep living, to keep tending the land, but without her laughter in the house, the days turned to dust and the years to stone. He stopped counting them after the railroad came through town. That night, the storm rolled in without warning. The air smelled of rain and dirt, and the sky cracked open with lightning that split the valley in two. Henry was finishing his supper when the old horse began to snort and stomp in the barn. At first, he thought it was coyotes again, hungry things driven close by the storm. He grabbed his lantern and shotgun, stepping into the wind. The rain came hard, stinging his face, turning the yard to mud. But as he reached the barn, he heard something else, a soft, muffled sound, not quite animal, not quite human. He pushed open the door, the lantern light cutting through the dark. At first, he saw nothing. Just the shape of hay bales and the slow breath of his horse. Then his eyes caught movement behind the feed barrels. A figure, small, trembling. He raised the light higher. It was a girl, her dark hair tangled, her face streaked with dirt and rain. Her eyes flashed wide with fear as she backed against the wall, clutching a torn blanket around her shoulders. Henry froze. She couldn't have been more than 20. Apache by her braids and the beads she wore around her wrist. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain hammered the roof like bullets. Henry lowered his gun, keeping his voice low. "You hurt?" he asked. She didn't answer, just stared, breathing hard. He took a step forward, slow and careful. "Ain't gonna hurt you, girl." She flinched, pressing herself tighter against the wood. That look, it broke something in him. The same look he'd seen on wounded horses, on men who'd lost everything. He set the lantern on a hook and unbuttoned his coat. "You're cold, here." He held it out. She didn't move, so he placed it beside her and stepped back. Minutes passed before she reached for it. When she did, her hands shook. Henry turned away, giving her space, pretending to check the horse's reins. "Storm will pass by morning," he said. "You can rest here till then." Her voice came barely a whisper, broken English, soft as a prayer. "No, soldiers!" That word hit him like a knife. He looked at her again, at the blood crusted on her ankle and the bruises on her wrist. She'd been running. From what, he didn't know, but it didn't take much guessing. He brought her water and a piece of bread. She ate like she hadn't in days, eyes darting up every few seconds, as if expecting him to strike. He didn't. He just sat on a stool, watching the rain leak through the roof, thinking how strange it was. After 40 years of silence, his home finally had another heartbeat in it. When she finished, she pulled the coat tighter and curled into the hay, eyes closing before he even turned to leave. Henry stood there for a long time, listening to her breathing against the storm. Something about it stirred the old ache in his chest, the one he'd buried with Anna. He thought of all the years that had passed, the long winters, the lonely meals, the empty bed. Maybe it was the wind or the whiskey, or just the sound of another human being under his roof again. But for the first time in decades, Henry didn't feel completely alone. When dawn came, the world was washed clean, quiet and white. The storm had moved on, leaving the land covered in a thin sheet of frost. Henry went to the barn, unsure what he'd find. The girl was awake, sitting up, the coat still around her shoulders. Her eyes met his, and for a heartbeat neither of them spoke. Then she nodded, a small, grateful. "Thank you," she said in halting words. Henry nodded back, unsure what to do with the strange warmth in his chest. He handed her another piece of bread and a tin of coffee. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Tessa," he nodded. "Well, Tessa, storm's over. You can rest a while, then we'll figure what's next." She said nothing, just stared at the rising sun through the cracks in the barn wall. He saw the tears she tried to hide, and for a reason he couldn't name, he didn't look away. As he stepped out into the cold morning air, Henry Cole realized something had changed. His house still stood the same, his world still empty and wide, but the silence he'd once called home suddenly felt different, lighter, alive. He didn't know who she was, or why fate had brought her to his door after all these years. But one thing was certain, the storm had carried more than rain that night. It had brought back the sound of life. The wind had softened by morning, brushing gently through the grass instead of tearing it from the roots. Henry Cole stood outside his cabin, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the sun climb slow and gold over the desert hills. Inside, he could hear the soft crackle of the fire and her quiet footsteps moving about the small space. It had been years since there was another sound in that cabin, besides the creak of wood and the wind. Now it felt almost alive again. She stayed without asking, and he didn't tell her to leave. It was easier that way. She swept the floors, gathered water from the creek, and fixed his old horse's leg with a strip of leather. Henry noticed how careful she was, how her hands, though young, carried the steadiness of someone who had already seen too much. They didn't talk much. He'd ask simple things. "You eat? Or need more firewood?" And she'd nod, sometimes smiling just enough to show she understood. But there was something in the silence between them that said more than words ever could. At night, they'd sit near the fire, the glow painting the room in gold and shadow. Henry would mend his saddle straps while she mended her torn dress. Once she hummed a tune, low and sad, like something from another world. He didn't recognize it, but it stirred something in him, something deep and buried. When she stopped, he found himself wishing she hadn't. He didn't tell her that, though. He just poured her another cup of coffee and watched her hands wrap around it for warmth. One evening, while the wind moaned through the hills, she found an old photo on the mantel, a faded picture of a young man and woman standing beside a horse. She pointed at it, curious. Henry's eyes softened as he took it from her. "That was my Anna," he said quietly. "She passed long time ago." The girl, Tessa, bowed her head slightly. "You loved her?" she asked in broken English. Henry's throat tightened. "Still do." She didn't say anything more, but the look in her eyes told him she understood the kind of loss words couldn't hold. Days turned into weeks. The storm passed, but she stayed. She started humming again when she worked, feeding the hens or washing the dishes. Henry found himself listening for it every morning. Sometimes she laughed, small, quick bursts of sound that felt like sunlight in a cold house. He didn't laugh back, but inside something began to thaw. He caught himself speaking more, telling her where to find tools, or stories about the land, or how the river used to run deeper before the drought. She'd listen with quiet eyes, nodding as if his voice meant more than the words themselves. One afternoon, she came to him holding a piece of wood she'd carved, a small horse, rough but full of spirit. She placed it on the table beside his coffee. "For you," she said softly. Henry ran a hand over it, feeling the marks of her knife, the care in every cut. "You made this?" She nodded. "My father teach me." He looked at her then, really looked. And in that moment, the years between them vanished. He didn't see the lost girl anymore. He saw a survivor, someone who'd known pain, but still had gentleness left to give. That night, he couldn't sleep. The fire had burned down to coals, and the cabin was still. He watched her sleep on the cot across the room, her face peaceful in the dim light. He thought of all the years he'd spent alone, the countless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering why he'd been spared when everything he loved had been taken. But now, as he looked at the young woman breathing softly under his roof, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in years. Life still found a way to come back, even to men like him. The next morning, she was up early, feeding the horse and singing quietly to herself. When he stepped outside, she turned and smiled, a simple, unguarded smile that made the whole world seem lighter. "You're kind," she said in her slow, careful English. "Like my father was." Henry froze. The words hit him harder than any bullet. For 40 years, he'd been a shadow, a man waiting for time to finish what grief had started. But hearing her say that, it made him feel seen again. It made him feel human. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and went about his work. But for the rest of the day, he couldn't shake the warmth her words had left behind. The way she looked at him, not as an old man or a stranger, but as someone good, someone worth trusting. That night he prayed for the first time in decades, not for forgiveness, but for her safety, for her to find the family she'd lost. When spring came, the snow melted from the hills, and the creek began to sing again. One morning, she stood by the fence, the carved wooden horse in her hand. "I go now," she said softly. Henry's chest tightened. "You sure?" She nodded. "My people wait." He wanted to ask her to stay, but he didn't. He'd learned long ago that love, even the quiet kind, couldn't be caged. He watched as she saddled the horse he'd given her, the sun turning her hair to gold. Before she rode off, she turned back. "You saved me," she said. He shook his head. "No, ma'am. You saved me first," she smiled, that same small, bright smile, and rode toward the horizon until she was nothing but a shadow in the light. That night, Henry sat by the fire, the carved horse in his hands. The cabin was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was gentle now, living. He looked at the old photo of Anna on the mantel and smiled for the first time in 40 years. He had spent his life thinking the world had taken everything from him. But that night he finally understood. Sometimes the desert gives back not what you lost, but what your heart forgot how to feel. And as the flames danced before him, Henry Cole whispered into the empty room, "Thank you, Tessa."